In a world where the mind is rarely allowed to rest, where each passing day becomes a stream of notifications, expectations, and thoughts that never truly stop, perhaps what exhausts us most is not work or time itself, but the quiet pressure to understand everything. In time, to understand who we are, to understand where the world is heading, to understand why we still feel empty even after trying so hard. Silent Orbit was created for this moment, not to offer more answers, but to give you a safe place, a space where you can gently set your questions down for a while and simply listen. Tonight, allow yourself to slow your pace as if drifting into the quiet orbit of ancient and profound ideas. Their philosophy is no longer something to argue with, but a soft whisper guiding you through reflections on the universe, on humanity, and on your own inner life. As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Nowhere you can go is more peaceful than your own soul." Perhaps this universe is not what we were taught it was. Yet within that uncertainty, there is a very real sense of calm enough for your mind to settle, and enough for sleep to arrive naturally and without effort. Perhaps the first thing that truly exhausts modern humans is not that the world has become too loud, but that we have been taught to believe it must possess a clear order, a solid center, a coherent story to which we can cling. We are taught that the universe began with a violent explosion, that everything has an origin, a direction, a destination. And somewhere within that narrative, even if no one says it out loud, we are also taught that humanity occupies a somewhat special position close enough to the center to observe, important enough to understand. Yet the longer we live, the more we think, the more we sense that something does not quite align. This feeling of dislocation does not arise from a lack of knowledge, but from the possibility that the story we were given was never entirely true. In modern physics, the Big Bang is no longer understood as an explosion within space, but as the expansion of space itself. There is no central point from which everything burst outward, no edge that the expansion will one day reach. Every point in the universe can be considered a center, and at the same time the center of nothing at all. When we observe galaxies drifting away from one another, we are not witnessing chaos, but a quiet order, a slow, steady process unfolding without the need for witnesses. This stands in stark contrast to human intuition, for our minds crave a clear beginning, a defining blast, a moment we can name. The universe, it seems, has no interest in fulfilling that desire. There is a strange comfort in the idea that the universe has no center. For where there is no center, there is also no periphery. No place that stands outside the story. No point that is more privileged than another. The feeling that we stand at the middle of understanding a position from which everything can be comprehended, measured, and classified is in truth a deeply human illusion. We observe the universe from where we are and unconsciously assume that this perspective is somehow special. Yet if we could move to a distant galaxy and look back, we would see the same kind of expansion unfolding there as well. Not because we are exceptional, but because the universe allows every point to feel as though it stands at the center. The distinction between the observable universe and the total universe makes this limitation even clearer. The observable universe is not the whole of existence, but only the portion whose light has had time to reach us since expansion began. Beyond that boundary may lie countless structures, motions, and possibilities that we will never see, not because they do not exist, but because time and space simply do not stand on our side. Recognizing this is not meant to make us feel small, but to remind us that knowledge always has edges, and humility begins with accepting those edges. Philosophy sensed this long before modern science found the mathematics to describe it. Immanuel Kant argued that the human mind does not access the thing in itself, but only the world as it appears through our own cognitive frameworks. The world we perceive is not the world as it truly is, but one filtered through sensation language and structures of thought. In this context, humanity's tendency to place itself at the center is not arrogance, but a natural consequence of how we exist. Yet when we slow down enough to observe this very mechanism, we begin to see that this sense of centrality is not truth, only a temporary viewpoint. Perhaps that is why Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, "There are no facts, only interpretations." This statement is not a denial of reality, but a liberation from the illusion that there exists a single, absolute, stable way of seeing. Applied to cosmology, this becomes especially clear. Every model of the universe is an interpretation built upon finite data. Every theory is a temporary bridge spanning the gap of the unknown, and like all bridges, they are constructed to serve the journey, not to become the final destination. In our inner lives, we often carry the same mistaken expectation that the self must have a clear center, a stable identity, a definitive answer to the question, who am I? But like the universe itself, human beings are not static. We expand through time, change through experience, and continuously reorganize ourselves without any dramatic explosion to mark the shift. Carl Jung described this not as the discovery of a fixed self, but as a long process of individuation, of becoming, rather than a completion. In Memory's Dreams. Reflections, he wrote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." The words echo like a whisper, aligned with an expanding universe. No fixed center, only continuous movement. When we accept that the universe did not begin with a bang, but with a quiet unfolding, we may also allow ourselves to release the need for dramatic new beginnings. Not every change requires a climax. Not every healing must be theatrical. Sometimes peace comes from realizing that we are already part of a process far longer than we imagined, a process that does not demand full understanding, only that we remain gently within it. Marcus Aurelius once reminded us in Meditations, "Observe constantly that all things take place by change." When we see the universe as a continuous flow of transformation, without center, without edge, without absolute ground, we may begin to look at ourselves with greater gentleness. Instability is no longer failure. Uncertainty is no longer a flaw. They are simply the nature of existence. And when we stop trying to stand at the false center of understanding, we can drift more lightly within the orbit of our own lives. Perhaps that is why the first chapter of this journey does not end with a conclusion, but with a pause. The universe did not begin with a bang, but with a silent opening. And perhaps your sleep tonight will not arrive from finding the right answer, but from allowing yourself to open slowly, without a center, without a direction, just calm enough to hear the faint rhythm of your own mind expanding. If in the previous chapter we allowed ourselves to release the idea of a universe with a center, an edge, a loud and dramatic beginning, then here, now that the mind has settled a little, we can take one step further. Not a fast step, but a deeper one. For when silence becomes dense enough, hypotheses that once felt distant can suddenly feel strangely intimate. One of these is the idea that this universe, this entire space we inhabit, might resemble a black hole. Not in the literal sense, not as a dark object devouring everything, but in a subtler way as a structure with an observational boundary, an interior, and realities that remain forever out of reach. In black hole cosmology, a hypothesis that sits at the edge between science and contemplation, physicists have posed a simple yet profound question. What if the equations that describe our universe are the same equations that describe the interior of a black hole? What if what we call the boundary of the observable universe is effectively equivalent to an event horizon, a point beyond which information can never return? This idea does not claim that the universe is a black hole, but suggests that the deep structure of reality may not be as different as we tend to assume. An event horizon in physics is not a material wall, but a boundary of knowledge. To cross it is not to collide with something, but to enter a region from which no signal can ever return. From the inside, there is no sensation of crossing, no sound, no marker. Only a new reality in which the concept of outside becomes meaningless. There is something eerily similar in the way human beings experience their own inner lives. There are thresholds we cross without realizing. It shifts in awareness, after which there is no way back to who we were before. Not because we refuse to return, but because perception itself has changed direction. If our universe truly resembles a black hole, then everything we observe, galaxies' background radiation, the flow of time, exists entirely within a larger structure, an outside that we cannot access, cannot verify, and perhaps do not need to know. At a deeper level, this hypothesis opens the idea of nested universes, universes within universes. A black hole in our universe could, according to some models, be a gateway to another universe where the laws of physics continue to operate in their own distinct way. And within that universe, other black holes may exist, giving rise to further realities. This idea is often captured by an ancient image, turtles all the way down. In a folktale, when asked what the world rests upon, the answer is that it stands on the back of a turtle, and that turtle in turn stands on another turtle endlessly. The image is not meant to explain physical structure, but to express a philosophical truth. Every foundation we search for ultimately leads to another question. There is no final ground on which we can stand and declare that everything is now certain. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, "Whereof one cannot speak thereof, one must be silent." The line is quiet, yet it resonates deeply with hypotheses like black hole cosmology. There are things that language, mathematics, and human imagination can approach only up to a certain limit. Crossing that limit is not misunderstanding, but entering a necessary silence. And perhaps that silence is precisely the place most suited for deep sleep. In Depth Psychology, Carl Jung spoke of the unknowable, those aspects of reality and of the self that can never be fully brought into conscious light. In Psychology and Alchemy, he wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." When we face the idea that there may be an outside to the universe that we will never reach, our first reaction may be anxiety. But if we slow down, we may find a quiet consolation within it. We are not required to carry the burden of understanding everything. Some boundaries exist not to challenge us, but to allow us to stop. The notion that we might be living inside a black hole also dissolves another illusion, the belief that every door is meant to open for us. In the literature of Dostoevsky, especially in Notes from Underground, we encounter a voice that recognizes that not every structure of the world exists to serve reason and control. Man is sometimes extraordinarily passionately in love with suffering, he wrote. Perhaps because it is in suffering and limitation that humans sense their finitude, and in that finitude discover another form of freedom. Freedom from the illusion of omnipotence. If there truly are layers of reality beyond this universe's event horizon, then the outside is no longer a place to long for, but a concept we must learn to release. Just as in personal life, there are questions not meant to be answered, but to be lived with. There are anxieties that do not vanish with understanding, but soften only when we stop trying to grasp them. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." Yet perhaps after the star has been born, what is needed is no longer more chaos, but a silence deep enough to let it shine on its own. On the level of lived experience, accepting that the outside may never be meant for us is not a failure, but a liberation. We do not need to exit the universe to find meaning nor cross every horizon to feel that we are living rightly. As Marcus Aurelius reminded us in Meditations, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. When thoughts cease reaching outward, cease searching for an absolute anchor, they can return to their own natural rhythm. And so, from the previous chapter to this one, we do not leave the universe, we simply move deeper into its structure, and at the same time, deeper into the structure of our own minds. If this universe truly resembles a black hole, then perhaps it also resembles sleep, a state where the boundaries of control dissolve, where we no longer need to see the outside in order to feel safe. In this space, the inability to return to observe the whole is no longer frightening, but becomes a gentle invitation to remain still. If we are living inside a black hole, then perhaps the outside was never meant for us, but perhaps it never needed to be. For right here within this quiet interior, there is already enough darkness to rest enough depth to stop searching, and enough silence for sleep to arrive not as an escape, but as a slow, soft, and deeply real return. After we have remained still for long enough within the idea that the universe may resemble a black hole, that there are boundaries not meant to be crossed, and outsides that never need to be reached, the mind begins to soften. As the anxiety of having to understand everything settles, another question emerges, lighter in weight, yet deeper in reach. If the universe has no fixed center, if it exists entirely within a closed structure of observation, then what truly was its moment of origin? Did everything begin from an infinite point, an absolute singularity where all laws collapse? Or is that simply another human way of telling the story, a narrative too familiar with violent beginnings and explosive moments? In recent decades, some cosmological models have begun to re-examine that question. Instead of a singularity where density becomes infinite and time loses meaning, they propose a different image, gentler yet no less profound, the bounce. In this view, our universe did not emerge from nothingness but from a hyper-compressed state of a prior reality. When a certain threshold was reached, rather than collapsing into infinity, that structure rebounded, opening into a new phase of expansion, not creation from zero, but a phase transition of existence. There is a quiet beauty in this idea. A bounce is not as loud as an explosion, not dramatic or final. It evokes the image of a deep breath, an inhale carried to its limit, followed by a natural exhale. If the Big Bang was a bounce, then the universe is not a story of absolute beginnings, but a new chapter in a flow far longer than human imagination can easily grasp. And when we allow ourselves to see the universe this way, the panic surrounding origins begins to ease. In physics, a singularity is always a sign of a limit. When equations yield infinities, it does not necessarily mean that reality itself is infinite, but that our tools have ceased to be adequate. Much like in inner life, when everything feels too much, too compressed, no longer bearable, this does not always signal collapse. Sometimes it simply marks the approach of a transformation. Carl Jung spoke of such moments not as breakdowns, but as necessities for a new form of consciousness. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain, yet that pain is not the end. It is the pressure before the bounce." Bounce cosmology also shows a striking parallel with cosmic inflation. After the rebound, space expands rapidly and evenly, producing a universe that is flat, uniform, and nearly without preferred direction, precisely what we observe today. This leads to a subtle question: might what we call the Big Bang be merely the echo of something deeper, a continuation rather than a creation? Might the universe, like a human being, carry traces of earlier states even if we cannot consciously recall them? There is an unnamed comfort in this idea, for if there is no absolute singularity, then no moment is completely severed from what came before. Everything has a prehistory, even if that history lies beyond our observational reach. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza viewed reality as a single substance operating through internal necessity. In Ethics, he wrote, "Nothing in nature is contingent, but all things are from the necessity of the divine nature determined to exist and act in a certain way." Though his language is metaphysical, its spirit resonates closely with modern cosmology. There are no arbitrary beginnings, only necessary transitions. When we apply this perspective to human life, something unexpectedly gentle occurs. We often view major life events as personal big bangs, a loss, a rupture, a moment after which everything before seems meaningless. We say that from here, our life starts over. But seen more deeply, these moments may resemble a bounce rather than an explosion. They do not erase the past entirely. They compress it, transforming it into energy for another phase of being. Not creation from nothing, but continuation in a new form. Friedrich Nietzsche touched this intuition when he spoke of eternal recurrence. Though often interpreted cosmologically or ethically at a deeper level, it suggests that existence is not a straight arrow, but a series of loops, transformations, and reconfigurations. In The Gay Science, he wrote, "What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, 'This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more.' To face this idea is not to accept mechanical repetition, but to learn to see each moment as a point of transition, neither entirely new nor entirely old. If the universe emerged from a bounce, then time is no longer a stream beginning at zero, but a field of transformation, where every beginning already carries the imprint of what preceded it. This softens the burden of creation. We do not need to recreate ourselves from nothing whenever we wish to change. We only need to allow another state to emerge once the old one has been compressed deeply enough." At the deeper level of psychology, Sigmund Freud described mental life not as a sequence of isolated events, but as an energetic system constantly seeking transformation. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he wrote, "The aim of all life is death." The statement sounds bleak, but when placed alongside the idea of the bounce, it can be understood differently. Every living state carries within it a tendency toward its own ending, not to vanish, but to make room for another form. The death of a structure does not mean the end of energy, but the condition for reorganization. And as we return to our journey tonight, this idea begins to merge with the rhythm of breathing. No absolute singularity means there is no moment in which we must entirely start from scratch. No mistake erases everything we have been. There are periods of intense compression moments when it feels impossible to endure anymore, but it may be precisely in those moments that a quiet bounce is forming. Not loudly, not visibly, only requiring time. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Time is like a river made up of the events which happen and a violent stream, for as soon as a thing has been seen, it is carried away and another comes in its place. That river has no clear beginning within our sight nor a fixed end. It simply flows, changes. Shape changes, rhythm changes direction, like the universe in the bounce model and like the human mind when it is allowed to loosen its grip." And so this chapter does not end with a definitive claim about the origin of the universe. It gently sets down a possibility. Perhaps beginning is not birth, but continuation in another form. Perhaps what we call new is only another shape of what has already existed. And if so, then rest deep sleep and the temporary suspension of our need to understand everything are not emptiness, but a necessary phase of compression before the next bounce. In this quiet, as you listen to the words drift by like a slow current, without needing to remember, without needing to grasp. Perhaps your own mind is doing what the universe once did, compressing very gently, very deeply, and then releasing not into nothingness, but into a soft sleep where all beginnings are allowed to wait and all continuations need not hurry. As we gradually grow accustomed to the idea that the universe may not have begun with an explosion, that its beginning may have been nothing more than a quiet rebound of existence, the mind begins to loosen its grip on what once felt unquestionable. When the great questions lose their sense of urgency, we can begin to look at smaller details with a gentler kind of attention. And sometimes it is precisely these details, barely perceptible deviations in the data, that unsettle humanity's most deeply held convictions. This chapter begins with an observation that appears purely technical, yet quietly opens a deep fissure in how we understand the order of the universe. In an ideal universe described by the standard model, galaxies, when observed from a great distance and in sufficiently large samples, should rotate in random directions. There is no reason for most of them to choose the same direction of spin. The scientific intuition here is clear: if there is no preferred axis, then all directions are equal. Yet when the James Webb Space Telescope began sending back more detailed data about distant galaxies, something unexpected emerged. A significant fraction of galaxies appeared to rotate in the same direction. Not all of them, not enough to declare a new law, but enough to cause a subtle tremor in human confidence. That tremor does not arise from a conclusion, but from the question itself. Why does this asymmetry exist? If the result is real, then one of two things must be true. Either our universe genuinely possesses a preferred direction, some hidden axis we have never known, or the way we observe and interpret the data is distorted by unconscious assumptions. Neither possibility is comfortable. The first challenges the foundational principle that the universe is homogeneous and isotropic on large scales. The second reminds us that humanity may have been mistaken from the very starting point. There is something profoundly human in this fragility. For a long time, we have grown accustomed to believing that once our instruments are refined enough and our data abundant enough, reality will naturally reveal itself. But science, at its deepest level, is not a machine that manufactures truth. It is an ongoing practice of adjusting humility. Each new data set does not merely add information, it adds responsibility, the responsibility to re-examine what we once took for granted. And sometimes, as in this case, data does not break the universe. It only breaks human certainty. The philosopher Karl Popper emphasized that science does not advance by confirming hypotheses, but by allowing them to be falsified. In The Logic of Scientific Discovery, he wrote, "Our knowledge can only be finite, while our ignorance must necessarily be infinite." The sentence is quiet, yet in the context of galaxies rotating in the same direction, it becomes strikingly alive. We may be accustomed to treating randomness as the universe's default state, but perhaps that randomness too is only a model, a temporary expression shaped by a finite mind. If the universe truly has a preferred axis, that does not necessarily make it simpler. On the contrary, it opens a new layer of complexity, where space and time may possess subtle asymmetries we have never noticed. But if the issue lies in how we observe, if Earth itself, the Milky Way, or our position in space has unconsciously imposed a skewed frame of reference, then the story turns in a different direction. In that case, the universe has not changed. Only the human gaze requires recalibration. In inner life, we often stand before similar situations. We observe the world from our own position, and then assume that what we see reflects the overall order. When many events seem to rotate in the same direction, recurring failures, familiar anxieties, we easily conclude that some axis of fate is governing our lives. Yet it may also be that our perspective is distorted by memory, expectation, or assumptions that have never been questioned. Recognizing this is not meant to deny experience, but to open the possibility of seeing differently. Immanuel Kant warned that the human mind does not encounter the world as it is in itself, but as it appears through the structures of cognition. In Critique of Pure Reason, he argued that space and time are not properties of things in themselves, but forms of human intuition. If this is true, then even when we see galaxies rotating in the same direction, we must still ask what belongs to the universe and what belongs to the way we compel the universe to appear. The asymmetry in JWST data therefore carries a particular kind of beauty. It does not rush toward an answer. It simply stands there quietly like an open question. And in that quietness, it invites humanity back to the original posture of philosophy, not the hunger for control, but the willingness not to know. Socrates was famously recorded as saying, "I know that I know nothing," not as an act of self-diminishment, but as a necessary starting point for any profound understanding. If the universe has an axis, that axis does not have to mean anything to us. It does not need to explain itself, nor to serve. And if we are mistaken, that error is not a failure, but a step along the long journey of understanding. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "Inhuman, all too human error has turned animals into men. Might truth be capable of turning man into something more than man?" The question hangs there without demanding an answer, suggesting that deviation itself may be the engine of consciousness's evolution. At a deeper level, the idea of a preferred direction touches a very ancient human anxiety, the fear that the world is not entirely neutral, that some paths are favored over others. Yet perhaps peace does not lie in proving that all directions are random, but in accepting that we do not need to stand in the correct direction. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." When data confuses us, the confusion does not arise from the universe, but from the expectation that the universe must be simple and conform to our models. And so, from the previous chapter to this one, we do not leave behind the idea of continuation, we merely encounter it in another form. If the universe's bounce reminds us that beginnings may be continuations, then the asymmetry of galaxies reminds us that understanding itself is a process of continual adjustment. There is no final model, no absolute resting point, only cycles of hypothesis, observation, doubt, and silence. This chapter does not close by choosing between the two possibilities, whether the universe has an axis or whether we are misunderstanding it. It closes with a gentle release. Sometimes data does not shatter the universe. It shatters human confidence. And in the moment when that confidence dissolves, a quiet space appears. That space is not meant to be filled immediately, but to be rested within. In that quiet, as you listen to these words drift by like distant galaxies, perhaps your own mind is learning to rotate more slowly, without a preferred direction, without a fixed axis. Simply drifting very softly in the acceptance that not every motion needs to be understood, and that within this not-knowing sleep may arrive like a silent agreement between you and a universe far larger than any model. After we accept that the grand motions of the universe may not be random in the way we once hoped, that data does not always collapse the world, but sometimes only unsettles human confidence, another question slowly emerges, smaller, closer, and perhaps heavier in a quieter way. If the universe is not arranged for the convenience of our understanding, then is life within it truly inevitable? Or is the existence of Earth, of forests and oceans, and of ourselves merely a temporary outcome among countless silent experiments of nature? We are often comforted by the belief that Earth is special, special because it hosts life, special because it holds consciousness, special because it has observers. Yet modern science, when it looks farther and longer, whispers a different story. Earth may not be special because it is unique, but simply because it has not yet vanished. Not because it won a cosmic competition, but because it has remained standing fragile for a span of time, just long enough for life to take root, evolve, and wonder about itself. When we look to our nearest neighbors in the solar system, this story becomes clearer. Mars, now a cold desert, once had rivers, lakes, and a thicker atmosphere. Venus, currently a thermal inferno with crushing pressure, may once have possessed oceans and a temperate climate. These worlds were not entirely dead from the beginning. They were almost worlds, places that came very close to the threshold of sustainable life and then slipped past it. There was no tragedy, no single moment of collapse, only a sequence of small changes accumulating long enough for livable conditions to dissolve. Life, it turns out, does not only need to begin, it needs to be sustained. Initiation can occur across a relatively wide range of conditions. But maintenance requires a balance so delicate it is nearly invisible to the naked eye. A slight shift in orbit, a small variation in stellar activity, a gradual loss of magnetic field or atmosphere. And over time, a world that once held promise becomes a place where complex biology can no longer persist. Not because nature failed, but because nature has no obligation to succeed. Hannah Arendt once wrote in The Human Condition, "The Earth is the very quintessence of the human condition." This is not a claim that Earth stands at the center of the universe, but a reminder that all human experience is bound to the very specific conditions of this planet. When those conditions change, that experience dissolves. Recognizing this is not meant to instill fear, but to return us to a softer form of awareness. Life is not guaranteed. On larger scales, when we consider billions of galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, each star potentially orbited by planets, the idea that life arose in only one place begins to feel less convincing. Yet, at the same time, the belief that life always persists, always advances, becomes just as fragile. There may have been countless worlds where chemistry once aligned delicately enough to produce biology, but not stably enough for that biology to endure. Those worlds leave no clear trace. They require no gravestones. They simply are no longer places where anyone remains to remember. In The Gay Science, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "The living is merely a rare form of the dead." The line may sound cold, but placed within a cosmic context, it carries a surprisingly gentle truth. Life is not the default state of matter. It is a refined exception appearing when conditions allow and disappearing when conditions change. And because it is an exception, it does not need to last forever to matter. In personal life, we often carry a similar illusion that good things, relationships, stable periods, moments of calm, once they appear, should persist. When they dissolve, we call it failure. But if we see life as a sequence of almost worlds, we may recognize that many phases do not fail, they are simply not sustained. Not because they were wrong, but because conditions changed. Sigmund Freud wrote in Civilization and its Discontents, "The intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation." He did not say this to invite despair, but to free humanity from the expectation that existence must be favorable, enduring, or clearly purposeful. Like life on Earth itself, happiness is not guaranteed. It is a window that opens and closes, sometimes long enough for us to notice, sometimes not. When we view Earth through this lens, a very quiet humility begins to form. This planet is not a victor in a hostile universe. It is only a temporary survivor. Not because it is stronger, but because so far it has not encountered enough conditions to collapse entirely. This does not diminish the value of life. On the contrary, it renders each moment of existence softer and more precious in a different way. Marcus Aurelius reminded us in Meditations, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years." The line does not urge haste, but invites us to loosen our grip on the illusion of permanence. When we know that nothing is promised forever, we may hold less tightly, demand less, and fear less when cycles come to an end. In cosmological terms, this leads to a gentle realization life is not an arrow aimed toward infinite progress, but a thin wave that can rise and fall depending on context. Earth at present stands at the crest of its wave, not an eternal crest, but the peak of a particular phase. This need not cause panic. It need only sharpen our presence in the now. And as we return to ourselves, to the rhythm of breathing in a darkened room, to the slow voice moving through the night, this idea may soften into something deeply human. We do not need to prove that we are special in order to deserve existence. We do not need to win in order to be allowed to rest. Like Earth itself, we may simply be survivors, not because we are exceptional, but because up to this moment, we are still here. This chapter does not close with a celebration of life, nor with a warning. It closes with a fragile balance. Earth has not won, but Earth has not yet lost. And in the quiet space between those two statements, there is room to release some anxiety, to loosen the pressure to exist correctly. Within that space, as failed worlds drift past like dreams without names, we may allow ourselves to fall into a peaceful sleep. Not to escape reality, but to pause within this reality. A reality that is not guaranteed, yet still unfolding very slowly, very softly, and just safe enough for a deep night of rest. After we have come to see Earth as a fragile survivor among countless worlds that have quietly vanished, another awareness begins to arise, lighter, closer, and deeply human. If life is not guaranteed, if this planet is only a temporary balance within the long current of the universe, then what of our bodies existing moment by moment upon this planet? Are they as fragile as everything else? Or within that fragility, is there a silent miracle at work, persistent, enduring, and asking nothing to be seen? We usually notice the body only when it hurts, when it is tired, when it resists. Yet most of the time, the body works in silence. It regulates temperature filters, blood regenerates cells, repairs tiny injuries we never become aware of. Even now, as you lie still and listen, billions of biochemical reactions are unfolding simultaneously with a precision so exact that if even a small fraction were to deviate, life would immediately be at risk. And what is remarkable is this: you do not need to do anything at all. There is a gentle truth that is rarely spoken in a tender way. Human beings emit light. Not light visible to the naked eye, but bioluminescence at the microscopic level, biological light produced by chemical reactions within cells. The light is too faint for us to perceive, yet it is there nonetheless, like a quiet reminder that life does not merely exist, but radiates, however softly. In the darkness of the room tonight, your body does not disappear. It continues to glow in its own biological way without needing a witness. The human vascular system, if laid end to end, would stretch for hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Cells within the body are constantly dying and being replaced. The skin you wear today is not entirely the same skin you wore a few weeks ago. Every breath is a delicate exchange between the environment and the interior. And all of this unfolds without requiring your conscious participation. You do not need to command the heart to beat. You do not need to remind the lungs to inhale. The body, quite literally, is a self-operating system. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza viewed the human being not as a soul commanding a body, but as a part of nature itself operating according to the same necessities. In Ethics, he wrote, "The mind and the body are one and the same thing conceived now under the attribute of thought, now under the attribute of extension. Seen this way, the division between me and my body begins to blur. There is no separate self standing outside directing everything. There is only a unified process unfolding quietly, steadily, without supervision." In modern life, we often live as though we must constantly be in control. Control schedules, control emotions, control the future. Yet the body stands as living proof that not everything needs to be controlled in order to function well. In fact, the most essential aspects of life occur precisely when we let go. When we sleep, consciousness withdraws, but the body does not shut down. It enters another mode where repair intensifies, where memories are reorganized, where energy is redistributed more wisely than any plan the waking mind could devise. Carl Jung spoke of the intelligence of the unconscious not as something inferior, but as another form of wisdom. In The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, he wrote, "The unconscious is not only evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." If this is true of the mind, it is also true of the body. There is a form of knowing that requires no words, no light, no attention. A knowing that understands when to repair, when to rest, when to release. When we place the human body within the cosmological context we have been moving through, something very gentle occurs. The body no longer appears as a machine that must operate flawlessly, but as a refined phenomenon of survival. Like Earth itself, it has not won a competition. It simply continues day after day under conditions that are just sufficient. And like Earth, it does not need to be special in order to deserve existence. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "There is more wisdom in your body than in your deepest philosophy." This does not diminish thought, but reminds us that intelligence is not confined to concepts and language. It lives in the heartbeat, in reflexes, in the capacity for self-regulation that the body has carried long before humans learned to ask questions about the universe. When we are exhausted by thinking, perhaps what is needed is not another idea, but a return to that silent wisdom. In modern psychotherapy, more and more approaches recognize that healing does not occur only through words, but through the body's sense of safety. When the body feels safe, the mind can release. And when the mind releases, the body gains even more freedom to repair itself. It is a cycle that requires no effort, only permission. Sigmund Freud, often seen as emphasizing inner conflict, also acknowledged the power of processes beyond consciousness. In introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, he wrote, "The ego is not master in its own house." This was not meant to weaken humanity, but to ease the strain of the illusion of control. If the ego is not the absolute ruler, then we are allowed to rest briefly from the responsibility of managing everything. And perhaps it is precisely here that the quiet miracle of the human body becomes most visible. Not loudly, not in need of proof, not seeking praise. It simply works. It keeps you alive through nights you do not remember. It mends fractures you never see. It continues even when you doubt yourself. And when you are too tired to do anything more, it remains there doing the rest for you. Marcus Aurelius once wrote in Meditations, "Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial." Yet elsewhere he also reminded us that nature has given each being the tools necessary to endure. The body is one of those tools not for battle, but for quiet persistence. And so from the previous chapter to this one, we move from planet to flesh, from the vast universe to the intimate space within. We realize that amid great uncertainty, something is happening more steadily than we assume. Your body is keeping you here in this moment, safe enough for you to soften. You do not need to understand it. You do not need to control it. You only need to remain still. This chapter closes not with a celebration of human strength, but with a gentle permission. You do not need to do anything in order to exist. Most of the time, your body has already done it for you. And within that awareness, as the role of consciousness temporarily recedes, perhaps sleep can arrive more easily, not as a collapse, but as a deep trust that in the darkness there is a silent intelligence standing watch, allowing you to rest very softly, very deeply, and very peacefully. After we allow the body to freely do its work without commands, without supervision, another door begins to open very softly. It is the door of sleep. Not as a sudden collapse, but as a natural movement when consciousness realizes it no longer needs to hold on. Sleep does not arrive to sever us from the world, but to change the way we are present within it. As the light softens and sounds slow, what happens is not a shutting down, but a shift of mode from control to trust. In neuroscience, sleep is not a single state. It is a sequence of subtle transitions. Non-REM comes first, like a still body of water where the heart rate slows, muscles loosen, and the brain gradually steps away from linear thought. Then REM appears quiet, yet vivid, where the brain works in a very different way. Memories are reorganized, emotions are processed, fragments of the day's experiences are placed into more suitable compartments. The body lies still, but inside deep work is taking place. What is remarkable is this sleep does not require our understanding in order to function. We do not need to know precisely when REM begins or when non-REM ends. We only need to allow the process to unfold. Just as the body regulates heartbeat and breath on its own, sleep is a form of innate intelligence, one that does not need conscious control. When we try to sleep correctly, sleep enough, or sleep efficiently, we quietly return consciousness to its controlling role, and it is precisely this that makes sleep harder to reach. In psychology, dreams were once seen primarily as messages, symbols, whispers of the unconscious that needed decoding. But more and more research points to a simpler and more comforting function. Dreams resemble a kind of cleaning. The brain selects which memories to keep, softens what is no longer needed, reduces the emotional intensity of experiences that were too strong. Not every dream means something in the way we want. Many dreams are simply excess material being reorganized so that in the morning we can continue living without carrying the full weight of yesterday. Sigmund Freud once wrote in The Interpretation of Dreams, dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. Yet perhaps that road is not meant to be walked with a flashlight of analysis, but to be carried along in darkness. Not to understand more, but to become lighter. When dreaming becomes an act of quiet maintenance, it ceases to be something that must be explained and becomes something that can be trusted. At a deeper level, sleep raises a very gentle philosophical question. What happens when the self temporarily disappears? In deep sleep, self-awareness dissolves. There is no role, no identity, no personal narrative. And yet life continues. The heart keeps beating, the brain keeps working, the body keeps repairing itself. This recalls an observation by David Hume in a treatise of human nature when he questioned the existence of a fixed self. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception and never can observe anything but the perception. When perceptions settle in sleep, the self settles with them and the world does not collapse. Sleep, therefore, is not an escape from reality. It is a humble acknowledgement that consciousness cannot carry everything, that there are limits we cannot cross by thinking harder, trying more, or tightening control. To sleep is to say enough not in defeat, but in an understanding of one's own boundaries. Marcus Aurelius once reminded us in Meditations, "If you seek tranquility, do less." The line is not meant only for daytime. It speaks just as clearly at night when the mind still wants to finish unresolved tasks. Sleep is the most natural way to do less, not through effort, but through release. When we look back at the previous chapters, from a universe without a center to boundaries that cannot be crossed, to bounces instead of beginnings, to failed worlds, and to the silent miracle of the body, sleep appears as a very gentle point of convergence. It follows the same logic as the universe, not absolute, not all-powerful, not in need of control. It shares the same spirit as life itself, existing through adaptation, not domination. And it carries the same wisdom as the body, working best when it is not watched. Carl Jung once wrote in the Red Book, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Yet perhaps not every darkness needs to be brought into the light. Some darkness only needs to be left alone to do its work quietly. Sleep is one such darkness, not opposed to consciousness but complementary to it, as night is today. In modern life, sleep is often treated as wasted time, an interruption, an unproductive gap. But when we slow down, sleep reveals itself as one of the deepest, purposeful activities humans still retain. It produces no objects, makes no decisions, solves no problems. It simply sustains the ability to exist in a healthy way. And in a world that constantly demands more, faster, and greater output, sleep becomes a very gentle refusal. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in Human, All Too Human, "The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently." Read differently in the context of sleep. The forced uniformity of waking consciousness can become exhausting. Sleep allows difference disorder and incoherence to exist without correction. And it is precisely within that incoherence that the mind finds balance again. And so as this chapter slowly closes, there is no call to sleep now. No technique, no complicated instruction. There is only a very gentle permission. You do not need to be fully here anymore. You do not need to keep up with every word. You do not need to remember what you have just heard. The body already knows how to sleep. The brain already knows how to change modes. Consciousness can let go. Sleep is not avoidance. Sleep is the acceptance of limits. And within that acceptance, there is a very deep peace. A peace that does not come from having every question answered, but from no longer needing to carry them into the night. As you let these words drift past like very small waves, perhaps you too are doing what sleep has always done, keeping what is needed and quietly letting the rest slip away. When consciousness has learned to loosen its grip in sleep, when we accept that not everything needs to be understood, another door opens very softly, a door that leads us back to the natural world, but with a gentler gaze. No longer a gaze that seeks to classify, compare, or determine right and wrong, but one slow enough to recognize that nature has never cared about human intuition. It does not need to make sense by our standards. It only needs to continue. In the stories we often tell, nature is personified as an intelligent architect, a wise teacher, or an optimized system. But when we look more closely, we see that nature is not optimized in any moral or aesthetic sense. It tries. It fails. It abandons. It keeps what is sufficient. And in this process, countless beings emerge not to illustrate an ideal order, but to demonstrate that there are many ways to continue. The axolotl amphibian living in the cool lakes of Mexico can regenerate lost body parts, legs, tail, even neural tissue. To human intuition, this appears miraculous, a superhuman ability. But to evolution, it is simply a solution. In an environment where injury is frequent, regeneration is merely a way not to disappear. The axolotl does not become a hero of nature. It simply exists quietly in its own way. The electric eel, with its ability to generate currents strong enough to stun prey, also carries no grand meaning. Electricity is not a symbol of power or intelligence. It is just an option. When a body can convert chemical energy into electrical pulses, evolution keeps that option not because it is beautiful, not because it is clever, but because it works in a specific context. Creatures like these often astonish or even confuse us because they do not fit familiar ideas of normal life. Yet that confusion is itself a sign that we are imposing our standards onto a system that never promised to follow them. Nature does not ask whether something is reasonable, it asks only whether it can continue. Charles Darwin wrote in On the Origin of Species, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." This line is often misread as a celebration of competition. At a deeper level, it is a reminder that there is no ideal template for life, only different responses to different circumstances. And those responses need not be noble, they need only be adequate. When we look at biological diversity, one thing becomes clear: there is no single correct way to exist. Some beings survive through cooperation, others through isolation. Some rely on long-term memory, others live entirely in the present. Some have complex nervous systems, others barely require a brain. All are different answers to the same silent question: how to continue under these conditions. The philosopher Gilles Deleuze spoke of life not as a stable structure, but as a process of becoming an ongoing transformation. In A Thousand Plateaus, he wrote with Félix Guattari, "Life is not confined to organic strata. It escapes them. When life is not boxed into familiar forms, it becomes far richer than human intuition allows. And when we bring this gaze back to ourselves, a strange relief appears. Much of human exhaustion comes from trying to live the right way, the right role, the right expectations, the right pace. But if nature does not produce a single mold for life, perhaps humans do not need to force themselves into an ideal shape to deserve existence." In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "I tell you, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." The line is often read as a call to creativity, but it can also be read as permission for chaos to exist, for ways of living that are uneven, imperfect, untidy. For in nature, chaos is not the enemy of order, it is the source of solutions not yet tried. When waking consciousness loosens its grip in sleep, we have seen that the body and brain still know how to work. When we look at creatures that do not obey our rules, we begin to understand that nature is the same. It does not need human intelligence to supervise it. It does not need a unified theory to continue. It needs only time and enough space to try. Carl Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The individual is the carrier of life, but perhaps the individual carries life not by controlling it, but by allowing it to pass through. Each being, each human, is only a temporary medium through which life attempts another form. And when that form no longer fits, life does not resent it. It simply quietly finds another path." In human life, this can be felt as a very deep kind of healing. We do not need to become the best version of ourselves according to some abstract standard. We only need to become a version that can continue within our present conditions. There are no medals for endurance, no rewards for strain, only the gentleness of adaptation, sometimes through change, sometimes through stopping. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Nature has given you everything you need to get through this life." The line promises no success and guarantees no happiness. It simply reminds us that the tools for continuation are already present, not in distant ideals, but in our very human capacity to respond to very specific circumstances. And so as this chapter drifts onward, we do not move away from sleep, but deeper into its logic. Sleep, too, is a solution, not a moral solution, not a heroic one, just a way to continue when wakefulness has become overloaded. Like the axolotl regenerating what was lost, like the electric eel using electricity instead of fangs. Sleep is one of life's options, quiet, effective, not requiring full understanding. This chapter closes not with praise for strange creatures, but with a very human release. Nature does not create heroes. Nature creates solutions. And if tonight your solution is rest deep sleep, the decision not to try any harder, then that is not weakness. It is simply another way to continue in a world that has never asked you to follow any law other than the very personal rhythm of your own being. Within that rhythm, as these words begin to fade, perhaps you too are doing what nature has always done best, choosing a solution that is calm enough, soft enough, and suitable for this moment. And so very slowly, very gently, you may allow yourself to drift into sleep, not as an ending, but as another form of existence, quiet and safe. When we have learned to see nature as an infinite collection of silent solutions, when we stop searching for heroes and accept the deeply human continuity of existence, a final question gradually emerges, not loudly, not urgently, as if it had been there from the beginning, simply waiting for the mind to become quiet enough to hear it. If everything is temporary, if the universe, life, consciousness, and even the stories we tell about them exist only for a finite span, then what truly matters? And does that question even require a final answer? In modern physics, one of the most unsettling phenomena is fine-tuning. The physical constants of the universe, gravity, Planck's constant, the speed of light, the strengths of the fundamental forces appear to be set with astonishing precision. A minute deviation in complex structures such as stars, planets, and biology would not be possible. This raises a question: was the universe designed, or are we simply living in one among countless universes where naturally only a life permitting one contains beings capable of asking the question? Both possibilities open different depths of uncertainty. If the universe was created, then who or what stands behind that creation for what purpose? And if there is no purpose, then is fine-tuning merely a random outcome within a space of possibilities so vast it defies imagination? In A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking wrote, "It would be very difficult to explain why the universe should have begun in just this way except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us." Yet immediately after he left the door open to other interpretations, not to close the question, but to keep it open. The idea of an artificial universe, or even a simulated one, arises from the same unease. If constants can be chosen, if laws can function as parameters, then this universe may be only one configuration within a larger set. But regardless of which hypothesis is proposed, one thing remains unchanged: the limits of knowledge. We can construct models, but we cannot step outside the entire system to verify them. And perhaps it is precisely here that science meets the same boundary philosophy has long encountered. Immanuel Kant distinguished between phenomena, what we can experience, and noumena, what exists beyond direct cognition. In Critique of Pure Reason, he reminded us that some questions cannot be answered by pure reason, not because they are meaningless, but because they exceed the structure of human understanding. Questions of fine-tuning of the ultimate origin of the universe may belong to that domain where thought cannot advance further, yet contemplation can still remain. Then, like a gentle wave, the question of the universe's end arises. What happens when the universe ends? Heat death, where energy disperses until structure is no longer possible. The Big Crunch, where everything collapses into compression. The Big Rip, where expansion tears all bonds apart. These scenarios sound cold, yet they carry a quiet truth: nothing is exempt from time. Not even the universe itself. Martin Heidegger wrote in Being and Time Being Toward Death is the essential structure of Dasein. He spoke of human existence, but the idea can be extended to all that exists. Orientation toward an end is not pessimism. It is a way of understanding being as finite. When the universe itself can end, every moment within it becomes more fragile, and precisely for that reason, deeper. If the universe is temporary, then the questions we ask of it are temporary as well. There is no final answer guaranteed to endure forever. Each generation touches only a small portion of truth, then passes on to the next, a set of questions reshaped once again. In The Myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus wrote, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, not because the summit matters most, but because the act of questioning itself is already meaningful." When we turn back toward ourselves, the question if everything is temporary begins to sound different. It is no longer cosmological, but existential. If this feeling will pass, if this anxiety will not last forever, if even the self in its current form is only a phase, then how should we live? Perhaps not by gripping harder, but by being more still. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." When everything is seen as a process of transformation, impermanence no longer needs to be feared. It becomes the underlying rhythm of existence. No moment must carry eternal weight. No thought needs to be preserved forever, and no answer needs to be sealed as final truth. In psychotherapy, one of the deepest roots of anxiety is the demand for certainty. Certainty about the self, about the future, about meaning. But if the universe does not promise certainty, then releasing that demand in personal life may itself be liberating. Sigmund Freud wrote in Civilization and Its Discontents, "Unhappiness is much less difficult to experience than happiness. Yet perhaps happiness does not come from eliminating uncertainty, but from remaining with it without panic." When we look back over the entire journey from a centerless universe through uncrossable boundaries, bounces instead of beginnings, asymmetries that unsettle belief, failed worlds, the silent body sleeps release, and creatures living in their own ways, the final question no longer stands apart. It merges into a shared feeling that existence is not a problem to be solved, but a current to remain within. Carl Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. No central trunk, no single axis, only branching growths that touch the ground and continue in their own ways. Seen like this, impermanence is not a sign of meaninglessness, but the condition for richness." And so, this final chapter does not attempt to answer the greatest questions. It simply sets them down gently, the way one places a small lamp aside before sleep. Perhaps what matters is not understanding everything. Perhaps in a temporary universe, peace does not come from complete knowledge, but from allowing incompleteness. As these words drift beyond the field of attention, as you stop trying to follow every thought, perhaps you too are doing what the universe itself always does, moving into another phase. Not an ending, but a rest. Not an answer, but a pause. And within that pause, where everything is allowed to be temporary, sleep may arrive not as a loss, but as a quiet remaining very gently within this moment. And as this story slowly draws to a close, perhaps what matters most is not what you have just heard, but what you no longer need to carry with you. Along this journey, we have traveled far from a universe without a center, across boundaries that cannot be crossed, through the quiet bounces of existence, the asymmetries that unsettle belief, the worlds that came very close to life and then quietly slipped away to the human body. Working tirelessly, sleep, letting go, and beings living in ways our intuition could never have predicted. Yet if all of this had to be gathered into one very simple truth, it might be this: nature does not create heroes. Nature creates solutions. No creature defeats the universe. No planet is promised to last forever. No consciousness is granted a final answer. Everything simply continues under conditions that are just sufficient in countless different ways. And human beings, though we often forget, are part of that same movement. You do not need to understand everything in order to deserve rest. You do not need to discover ultimate meaning in order to sleep peacefully. Perhaps this very moment, when you allow yourself to stop, to add no more questions, no more effort, is already a form of very deep understanding. So if you are listening to this now with heavy eyelids as thoughts begin to dissolve, let that happen. There is no need to remember the names of concepts, hypotheses, or philosophers. No need to hold on to arguments or conclusions. Simply keep the feeling that this world is vast, strange, and not entirely meant to be understood. And within that very incompleteness, you are allowed to be small, allowed to be temporary, allowed to be unfinished. Now you may let this voice drift farther away. Let the words fade into the darkness. Let the body do its work as it always has. Not as an escape, but as a quiet trust. Within this silent orbit where no center is required, where no destination is needed, sleep can arrive very gently, very deeply, and exactly on time. Wishing you a peaceful night.